All in the game, yo.
It's all in the game.
This right here is part of the game, D.
It's all in the game.
It's all in the game, though, right?
The game is a game.
The game is the game.
That's the game.
That's the game, yo.
Now you're in the game.
The game is the game. The game is the fucking game.
The game is rigged, but you cannot lose if you do not play.
The Wire talks a lot about the game, and over the course of the show's 5 seasons we get to witness the entire ecosystem surrounding the war on drugs play this supposed game. But what is the game? And most importantly, how does one win it? Well, I would argue that the game is an individual's fight for position. The kingpins fight to remain kings, the mayors fight to remain mayor, and the police fight for their respective position in the police department. Of course, there's a few exceptions to the rule, but ultimately, everybody's either trying to remain in position or climb the ranks of their respective organisation. Now, as an example of somebody who won the game, consider Slim, who started out as muscle for the Barksdale organisation, however by the end of the show became a kingpin. Similar evaluations can be made for both Bill Rawls and Thomas Carcetti, who similar to Slim have basically won the game in terms of advancing their position. However, not everybody can be a winner, and tragically most who play, whether by force or decision, actually find themselves losing. And such is what I want to explore in today's video. What specific decision did a character make which ultimately lost them the game? After the downfall of Avon Barksdale, Bodie Broadus made the decision to go independent. However, upon building up his new corner, he soon found himself wedged between a hammer and an anvil, as the new king of the West Side in Marlo Stanfield gave him an ultimatum: either work under him or retire. And after some thinking, Bodie swallowed his pride and made the right decision, that being to give up his independency and work under Marlo. However, Bodie couldn't stand his new employer, and after the murder of his friend little Kevin, the final straw on the camel's back was broken, and Bodie had decided to do the one thing he never thought he would ever do.
Yo, I'm not snitching on none of my boys. Not my corner, and not no Barksdale people, or what's left of them. But Marlo, this nigga and his kind, man, they gotta fall. They gotta.
Now, Bodie's worst decision wasn't actually deciding to snitch on Marlo. Rather, it were failing to realise that everything Marlo had done, Bodie and the Barksdales had done before him. Where Bodie hated Marlo for punking him on his own corner, Bodie did exactly that to people in his very position just 2 seasons earlier. Where Bodie hated Marlo for killing little Kevin because he might have been a rat, Bodie killed his best friend in Wallace for the exact same reason. And where Bodie accused Marlo of killing just because he can, he failed to realise that the people he admired in Stringer and Avon killed just as many, if not more people for once again the exact same reason. Bodie's worst decision was ultimately failing to realise his own hypocrisy, and if he had just listened to Pooh, he might have outlasted Marlo, and could have eventually found himself working under Slim. The beginning of Season 2, Avon Barksdale's supply makes a decision to sever ties with him, as they accuse Avon of cooperating with the police in an attempt to reduce his time. And in learning this information, Proposition Joe makes the Barksdales a proposal. In return for a portion of Avon's territory, Joe offers to become their new supply. And at first, Avon is adamantly against this, and rightly so, as if Avon were to take Joe up on his offer, Joe would have one over on Avon, and the Barksdales might never get out from under him if Joe sees fit, and does exactly what he did in Season 3, that being playing Stringer and Avon against one another, resulting in the downfall of the entire organisation. You see, Avon eventually gives in to Prop Joe's demands after the whole situation with Brother Mouzone, a decision he'll later come to regret, as soon after Joe begins to manipulate Avon's partner into believing that in order to now keep Joe as their supplier, Stringer has to find a way to put an end to Avon's war with Marlo. And so Stringer snitches on Avon in an attempt to try end the war and keep what he's got going on with Joe. Avon winds up going to prison, ultimately because he gave Proposition Joe the power necessary to hold one over on both Stringer and Avon, allowing Joe to play the two against one another, and subsequently putting an end to the Barksdale organisation. And this was Avon's worst decision.
Yeah, you need to go to Prop Joe. I ain't gonna argue with you. You run it as you see fit.
After Chris Partlow and Marlo Stanfield get arrested in Season 5, Snoop Pearson becomes the head enforcer of the Stanfield organisation, and Snoop's first assignment is to take out Michael Lee, as Marlo speculates that Michael might be the reason behind him and Chris getting locked away. Now Snoop decides to go about setting up the hit in a very peculiar way. You see, she tries to trick Michael into thinking that he's joining her on the hit of Skinny Big Walter, where she'll then kill Michael with the help of the man she claimed they'd be taking out. However, Snoop makes a fatal mistake when trying to coerce Michael, as she tells him that he doesn't need to bring his iron, she has a new one for him. Which to me is just baffling, as why on God's green earth would you tell somebody who you know doesn't trust you to not bring his weapon? She also calls him out for having a problem with the hit, just giving Michael further reason to dislike her, as she knew full well from past experiences that Michael probably was going to have a problem. And to call him out on such yet again just serves no purpose, especially when it's just you and him. Michael of course clocks the reality of the situation anyway, and does in fact bring his iron, putting an end to Snoop Pearson.
What now, motherfucker, you shy?
Now at first I actually felt like Snoop saying this was a little bit of an authorial fear, a cheap way for the writers to save Michael Lee. However, upon researching for my video on Snoop Pearson, I realised the total opposite, and that Snoop had actually done stupid shit like this before, especially when it were left to her to plan the hit. As remember in Season 3 when Snoop orchestrated the drive-by on Pooh, something she would later replicate with O-Dog in Season 5. Both instances proved Snoop to be rather inefficient when it came to getting the job done, as she could only ever take out one target at a time. And take note, this was proven on every job Snoop worked without Chris Partlow. You see, Snoop was only as efficient as she was because she was working alongside Chris Partlow, somebody who made it easy for Snoop to do what she excelled at, that being her actual ability with a gun. However, the moment Chris was gone, Snoop exposed herself as being nowhere near as competent as we had been given her credit for, and the botched hit on Michael Lee, as well as the two other times she had to work without Chris Partlow made such clear. But ultimately, Snoop telling Michael to not bring his iron proved to be her worst decision.
You got a problem with that?
You straight?
No need to bring your iron. I got a clean knife for you to shave numbers. I'll pick you up tomorrow night.
The beginning of Season 4, Marlo Stanfield now finds himself at the head of the table, and with all his enemies gone, he's also now fortunate enough to not have to commit any more senseless killing. He even objects to such in his very first scene of the season, when one of his lieutenants suggests taking out an entire corner, all because of the actions of one man.
That what you think? Just do 'em more.
And take the fucking corner too.
What I want was some off-brand hilltop corner. And why I need to be stacking bodies when there wasn't no one trying to war with us?
Now from this moment onward, Marlo Stanfield for whatever reason just stops worrying about the consequences of dropping a body, and from here up until the end of the season, goes on to kill upwards of 17 people. Now, how Marlo dealt with those who he killed was for a time rather smart, However, hiding bodies from the police in vacant houses only served to be a short-term solution, especially when you consider the fact that literally everybody but the police knew where they were being hidden. Sooner or later, Marlo Stanfield was going to get found out. Now, when that time came, Marlo Stanfield actually got extremely lucky, as the unit after him had to be cut down to only Sydnor and Lester, who proved to not be nearly enough when it came to hunting down Marlo. However, because Marlo's crimes were just so unspeakable, some police weren't able to let it go, regardless of what their superiors told them, and such proved to be the undoing of Marlo, as if he hadn't murdered so many people, then the BPD's two greatest detectives wouldn't have sacrificed their careers to go after him. McNulty was no longer the obsessive man he was in Season 3, and Lester simply felt like there was nothing more to be done. Now, for those who want to argue that Marlo didn't really have an undoing, and therefore didn't really have a worse decision, as he was fortunate enough to leave the game with both his life and his money, I would argue such to not be true, as Marlo lost all that he deemed valuable. Not his life or his money, but rather the crown and the actual game as a whole. And he would have never lost the two if he weren't so violent and cocky, and didn't drop more bodies than both Stringer and Avon combined in a single season. But ultimately, Marlo's worst decision was thinking that he was invincible, and that he could dump countless bodies in vacant houses because he thought nobody would ever find them.
Keys, right here.
You know, if I was police, I don't think I could lean back on it. You?
Not if I was real police.
Right. Thank you, Detective.
After Omar Little robs the entirety of the co-op's resupply in Season 4, Marlo Stanfield asks Prop Joe to give up his nephew, so to try figure out whether or not Joe was behind the robbery. And Joe tells Marlo that he can't do it, he can't give up his nephew, and instead offers to introduce Marlo to the plug, as they too had people there and could confirm that Joe wasn't behind it. Now, one could argue that Joe introducing Marlo to the Greek was his worst decision, as what Slim Charles warned Joe might happen, that being Marlo going around the co-op and getting the connect for his own, did in fact happen, and it wound up being the end of Proposition Joe. Instead, Prop Joe should have gave up his nephew, who eventually gave up him, and he might have eventually wound up wearing the crown, seeing as though Marlo didn't last much longer than Joe. However, there's an issue, which is that Joe's nephew knew that Joe did in fact have a hand in the robbery, and so to give up Cheese would also mean to give up Joe. As let's be real, Cheese wasn't going to take one for the team and ride out whatever torturous thing it was Marlo were going to do to him for information. And so essentially, Joe had no choice but to reveal his meal ticket to the ruthless Marlo. Now, even though Prop Joe didn't have much of a say in introducing Marlo to the plug, he still should have at a minimum kept tabs on Marlo to make sure that he wasn't going to do what everybody was afraid of him doing. However, Joe did nothing, and he basically just left his life in the hands of another, just praying that the Greeks wouldn't side with Marlo over him. No string pulling, no devious Proposition Joe play, just pure prayer. And this was Prop Joe's worst decision.
Boss, you get that boy Marlo in line on our connect. He might try to go around the co-op. Go around us. You know what I'm saying?
Cautious as those Greeks be, who you think they gonna trust? They know us. They don't know him.
Now, the philosophy behind Bunny Colvin's Amsterdam is arguably one of the most heavily debated topics not just on The Wire, but also the internet as a whole. And I want you all to answer a question for me down in the comments section. Do you think the legalization or decriminalization of drugs in a controlled and contained zone like Amsterdam would actually work to reduce citywide crime? Now, my answer to this question, as well as thoughts on Bunny Colvin's Amsterdam, is that it's an experiment which would eventually prove itself to do more harm than it does good. Sure, at the start you may notice a significant drop in crime, but let me ask you all a question. How far does something like Amsterdam go? And how long does it take before it perhaps encompasses an entire city? You see, the legalization of drugs is bound to invite people who otherwise would have never thought to both take them and potentially make a living selling them. I mean, let's be real. Most drug dealers get involved in drugs simply because it's a fast and, dare I say, easy way to make a dirtload of money. Remove the largest downside to being a drug dealer, that being both death and jail, and you're now destined to see an increase in people resort to selling drugs in an attempt to make an easier living. And given time, a city like Baltimore may find itself entirely encompassed by such people. Now, that isn't to say that Bunny going through with Amsterdam was his worst decision, as frankly somebody needed to try something new, and I do give Bunny massive props for being that guy. But unfortunately for Bunny, Amsterdam proved itself to just not be viable in the long run, and it wounded up destroying both Bunny's career and all the credibility he had as a police officer. But as mentioned, let me know down in the comments section your guys and gals opinion on the matter, and maybe in the future I'll go more in depth on Amsterdam. Peace!